In a quiet suburban neighborhood, lined with manicured lawns and identical houses, one homeowner stood out, not by choice, but by circumstance. Mark was a simple man who valued hard work, peace, and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He had lived in his home for over a decade, watching the area transform from open countryside to an organized, rule-heavy neighborhood governed by an overzealous homeowners association. When Mark first bought the property, it came with a half-acre of extra land on the side, a small stretch of soil and trees that he used for his tools, an old shed, and a few classic cars he was restoring. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Over the years, the HOA board had become stricter, setting rules for everything: the color of front doors, the type of mailboxes, even the height of grass. Mark tolerated it all, keeping his peace and paying his dues. But one summer morning, he received a letter that changed everything. The HOA claimed that a part of his land, the extra side lot he had always owned, was, in fact, part of the community green space. They argued that old boundaries had been drawn incorrectly and that his fence sat beyond the approved property line. Without consulting him, they passed a vote to reclaim it, citing community beautification as the reason. Mark was stunned. That land was part of his deed, he had the paperwork. But the HOA didn't care. They sent warnings, fines, and legal threats, insisting he remove his structures and vacate the disputed area. Every week, another notice arrived, more aggressive than the last. At first, Mark tried to reason with them. He brought his property documents to the HOA meetings, but they brushed him off, saying they were correcting a community oversight. When he refused to move his things, they began issuing daily fines. The situation grew worse when the HOA president, a woman named Linda, decided to make an example out of him. She labeled him non-compliant and spread rumors that he was a hoarder ruining the neighborhood's image. Before long, neighbors who once waved hello began avoiding him. Some even supported the HOA's decision, thinking Mark's side lot was an eyesore. The pressure was unbearable, but Mark didn't budge. He hired a lawyer, but fighting the HOA was like swimming against a tide of money and influence. They delayed, appealed, and used community funds to drag the case out. After nearly a year of legal back and forth, Mark finally lost the battle. The ruling stated that the disputed portion of land was to be turned over to the HOA for community purposes. The moment the verdict came in, HOA workers arrived with contractors. They tore down his old fence, bulldozed the shed, and cleared everything he had built. It was devastating. Mark stood there watching his hard work crumble into dust, the cars gone, his tools thrown out, and the soil flattened as if his memories never existed. For weeks afterward, the HOA did nothing with the land. It remained an empty, barren patch next to Mark's house. They claimed they'd plant trees or build a walkway, but nothing happened. The sight of that bare ground became a daily reminder of what he had lost, not just property, but pride. One evening, as he sat on his porch staring at the wasted lot, a thought crossed his mind. The HOA had stolen his land under the guise of beautification. They wanted control, not community. If that's what they valued, then maybe it was time to show them the consequences of their greed. Mark began researching property boundaries, zoning rules, and community regulations. He discovered something the HOA had overlooked: while they had seized the side lot, they had no authority over what he did on his remaining property, as long as it met county code. They couldn't dictate the contents of his backyard, only its appearance from the street. A plan started forming. Not out of spite, but out of poetic justice. If the HOA wanted to take land they thought was ugly, he would give them something far uglier right next to it, legally. Within a month, Mark started collecting old materials, scrap metal, car parts, and rusted equipment, from nearby auctions and junkyards. He fenced his backyard with solid panels so no one could see what was happening. Curious neighbors whispered about strange deliveries, but Mark stayed quiet. He worked day and night, stacking, welding, and arranging what looked like chaos to an outsider, but to Mark, it was art. When the fence finally came down weeks later, the neighborhood gasped. Where there was once a clean, simple backyard, now stood what looked like a sprawling junkyard. Old cars were lined up neatly in rows, piles of metallic art stood in corners, and vintage machinery gleamed under the sun. It wasn't random clutter, it was structured, almost industrial, yet surprisingly aesthetic. The HOA was furious. They sent inspectors, letters, and complaints, demanding he remove it all. But this time, Mark was prepared. Everything he had built was within county compliance. His permits were in order, his taxes paid, and his property clean by legal definition. They couldn't touch it. Neighbors started visiting out of curiosity. Some began to appreciate the strange beauty of his setup. A local blogger featured it as a creative reuse project, and soon, word spread. Collectors started contacting Mark, offering to buy parts of his collection. Within months, his junkyard became a local attraction, and more importantly, a business. What started as revenge had turned into revenue. The same HOA that once stole his land now had to live with the sight of his thriving enterprise right beside their community space. And as trucks rolled in and out of Mark's property, bringing in buyers and money, the HOA realized they had made a serious mistake. But this was only the beginning. Mark had much bigger plans, and the HOA was about to find out just how valuable junk could be. By now, his junkyard had become a local landmark. People stopped by just to take pictures beside old tractors or admire the intricate sculptures he built from scrap. He began hosting weekend workshops, teaching people how to repurpose old metal into functional art. The events attracted everyone, students, artists, and even families looking for a unique experience. The more attention Mark's business received, the angrier the HOA became. Their board meetings turned chaotic, with members arguing over how to restore order. Linda, the HOA president, led the charge, insisting that Mark's business was damaging the neighborhood's image. She pushed for new restrictions, new fines, even attempts to change zoning laws. But every time they tried, Mark countered with documentation. His permits were legal, his operations were within code, and his taxes were paid. He had lawyers and advisors now, people who were more than happy to help him fight back against the HOA's overreach. Each failed attempt by the board made them look more powerless, and the neighborhood began to turn against them. Residents started questioning the HOA's motives. Why were they so obsessed with one man's property when the rest of the community had potholes, poor lighting, and other neglected issues? Some even began supporting Mark openly. A few homeowners volunteered to help him with events, offering parking space or promoting his business online. What was once a symbol of rebellion had turned into a point of pride for many. The shift in public opinion was something Linda couldn't control. She tried framing Mark as a nuisance, but it only made her look petty. When she attempted to organize a beautification project on the stolen land to overshadow him, almost no one showed up. The few who did realized quickly that it was more about ego than improvement. The neighborhood couldn't believe what Mark had created. What started as a silent act of defiance soon became the talk of the entire town. The so-called junkyard wasn't a pile of trash as the HOA had claimed, it was a collection of vintage machinery, restored car frames, antique parts, and industrial decor. Every piece had a story, every corner had character. It was an unconventional beauty that the HOA board members simply couldn't stand. Within a few months, Mark's backyard had transformed into a thriving side business. He began restoring rare items, selling them to collectors, and renting out certain pieces to studios for photography and film projects. His reputation grew quickly, spreading through social media and local news outlets. What the HOA had intended to destroy had now become a source of admiration and profit. The irony wasn't lost on Mark. The same people who once sneered at his property were now forced to drive past lines of customers, delivery trucks, and even journalists coming to interview him. He stayed calm and polite through it all, never showing anger or arrogance. He let his work speak for itself. Meanwhile, the HOA's community green space which they had taken from him, remained empty. No park, no garden, no walkway. Just a vacant, neglected patch of dirt, overgrown with weeds. The very land they claimed would beautify the neighborhood had become an embarrassing eyesore. Mark's business grew fast, faster than anyone expected. He started receiving calls from antique dealers and scrapyard owners offering partnerships. Soon, he wasn't just running a backyard project, he was running a legitimate company. He registered his business, got the necessary licenses, and expanded his operations to include a small warehouse nearby. The name he chose was simple but sharp, Rust to Riches Salvage Company. Meanwhile, Mark kept expanding. He acquired old cars, broken machinery, and scrap metal in bulk. What others saw as junk, he saw as opportunity. With every sale, he reinvested the profits into his business. Eventually, he purchased the abandoned lot next to the community, the same area the HOA had once considered off-limits for commercial use. When the paperwork cleared, the HOA was speechless. Overnight, Mark had become one of the largest landowners in the area. He installed proper fencing, hired a small crew, and turned the new property into an organized, clean salvage yard that attracted even more customers. Trucks came and went daily, and soon the once quiet community was buzzing with economic activity. Ironically, property values began to rise. The increased traffic brought in new businesses nearby, a coffee shop, a repair store, even a small antique market. Local officials praised the growth, calling it an unexpected revitalization. The HOA's argument about neighborhood value no longer held weight, because Mark's work had literally improved it. Still, Linda refused to give up. She filed a complaint with the city council, claiming Mark's junkyard violated aesthetic standards. She brought photos, petitions, and even exaggerated stories about noise and pollution. But the hearing didn't go the way she hoped. City officials reviewed Mark's records, saw his compliance, and acknowledged the positive economic impact. In fact, one council member publicly congratulated him for turning adversity into success. The HOA left the meeting humiliated. For the first time, their authority had limits, and everyone knew it. As months passed, Mark's junkyard empire continued to thrive. He hired staff, invested in new equipment, and began supplying materials for sustainable construction projects. His story spread beyond the town, drawing attention from national media. News outlets described it as the man who turned HOA revenge into $1 million business. By the time a year had passed, Mark's name had become known far beyond the neighborhood. His business had evolved from a backyard experiment into a thriving company valued in the millions. He had suppliers, investors, and employees, all working under the banner of Rust to Riches Salvage Company. What began as a spark of defiance had turned into a powerful symbol of independence and innovation. But for the HOA, it was a nightmare that never ended. Their once pristine image had been overshadowed by Mark's success. Every new article, every interview that praised his transformation, made them look smaller and pettier. Linda, the HOA president, couldn't bear it. She had built her reputation on control, on enforcing order, and Mark's presence reminded everyone that she no longer had either. Desperate to regain power, the HOA board decided to take one final shot at him. They gathered every complaint they could find, from noise to traffic to visual clutter, and submitted a formal request to the county demanding a full investigation into Mark's operations. They hoped that, this time, government bureaucracy would do what they couldn't, shut him down. When Mark received notice of the inspection, he didn't panic. He had built everything by the book. His paperwork was immaculate, his records transparent. But instead of just waiting, he decided to prepare for something bigger. He had learned by now that the best way to deal with people who thrive on power is to remove their power completely, not through anger, but through patience and precision. On the day of the inspection, officials arrived early. They expected chaos, piles of rusting junk, noise, and disorganization. What they found instead was an efficient, well-run operation. The yard was clean and systematically arranged. Workers wore uniforms, safety signs were properly posted, and documentation was ready before they even asked. Mark, however, stayed grounded. He never gloated. He knew revenge had started this journey, but now it had become something more, a lesson in resilience. Late one evening, he stood at the edge of his property, looking over the land that once caused him so much pain. The flickering lights from his warehouse reflected off polished metal, casting a warm glow over the area. Across the fence, the HOA's empty plot remained untouched, its weeds swaying in the wind, a silent reminder of their failure. He smiled to himself, not out of arrogance, but satisfaction. What they stole from him had become the seed of his success. What they tried to destroy had made him stronger. But Mark wasn't done yet. There was still one move left, one that would permanently end the HOA's control over his neighborhood. The final chapter of his story was about to begin. The inspectors were impressed. Mark gave them a full tour, explaining how each part of the business operated. He showed them the recycling process, the restoration area, and even the community programs he'd started, donating refurbished materials to schools and art projects. By the time the inspection ended, the officials had nothing negative to report. In fact, they praised the facility as a model for sustainable reuse. When the HOA heard about the results, they were stunned. Their plan had backfired yet again. Instead of tarnishing Mark's image, they had unintentionally given him more credibility. Local media caught wind of the inspection story, and headlines soon read, HOA's attempt to shut down local business ends in praise. The community's patience with the HOA finally broke. Residents began calling for Linda's resignation. Petitions circulated to dissolve or replace the board entirely. For years, people had tolerated the endless fines and restrictions, but now they realized how much harm those rules had done. They wanted freedom, and Mark had become the symbol of it. One evening, as the HOA gathered for what was meant to be a special meeting, something unexpected happened. A crowd of homeowners showed up, dozens of them. They filled the hall, demanding answers. Voices rose, and soon, the meeting turned into a confrontation. Homeowners accused the board of wasting funds, targeting residents unfairly, and abusing power. When Linda tried to restore order, she was met with boos. Someone stood up and proposed a vote to remove the current board entirely. It passed by a wide margin. For the first time in the community's history, the HOA leadership was dissolved, replaced by a temporary committee, one that promised transparency and fairness. Mark didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. The results reached him later that night through a neighbor who came to thank him. The same people who once avoided him were now expressing gratitude. His quiet stand against injustice had sparked change across the entire neighborhood. But Mark wasn't interested in revenge anymore. He had made his point, and he had found something more valuable than payback, purpose. With the HOA gone, he decided to invest in the very land they had stolen. After months of legal paperwork and negotiation, he bought it back, not through conflict, but through a clean transaction. The irony was poetic. The land that had once been the source of so much pain now belonged to him again, fair and square. But this time, he had a different vision for it. Instead of using it for storage or business expansion, he turned it into a small community park, simple, peaceful, and open to everyone. He planted trees, built benches, and placed a single sign at the entrance. It read, "Property once lost, now shared, for those who believe in building, not breaking." When the park opened, the neighborhood gathered to celebrate. Families came with children, local musicians played soft tunes, and people who once doubted Mark shook his hand. It was more than just a park opening, it was the end of an old chapter and the beginning of a new one. Over time, the story of Mark's junkyard empire spread far and wide. Journalists and influencers called him the man who outsmarted the HOA. He became a speaker at small business events, sharing his experience about turning setbacks into success. His company continued to grow, branching into recycling programs and eco-friendly initiatives across the state. He often looked back on how it all started, one letter, one piece of land, and one act of arrogance from people who thought they could control everything. If they hadn't tried to take what was his, none of this would have happened. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA had tried to erase him, but instead, they made him unforgettable. Years later, when people passed through the town, they still recognized the junkyard that started it all, no longer just a pile of metal, but a living reminder of resilience. Kids played in the park beside it, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had once been the center of a battle. And as for Mark, he never sought fame or power. He just wanted fairness. He found it not through fighting back in anger, but through patience, creativity, and hard work. The HOA had stolen his land, but in return, he had built something far greater, a legacy. And in the end, the man they tried to silence became the reason their rules no longer mattered.